The Historic Clothing project was started in 2007. The aim was to produce historically accurate clothing that could be worn by both staff and the volunteer interpreters on the museum site.
What I was trying to do was to unite my documentary research, both with the research I had done on Poplar Cottage as an exhibit at the museum and with the work of the Historic Clothing project. And I was very interested in trying to take academic research and translate it into a sort of material form that the visitor could see. In terms of producing the clothing, I'm entirely dependent on Barbara and also my colleague Lesley Parker to take my research and turn it into a three-dimensional object. And for an academic historian, that's a fairly unique piece of research to be involved with.
My involvement with historic clothing goes way back to when I was at art school in Cambridge, and I used to make theatrical clothing for the theatres there, and that led me to really want to know how the clothing was made, how it was worn, how it behaved when it was worn, and I have a great interest in the sewing techniques as well.
My interest in historic clothing came out of the work I was doing on the rural poor, which included a lot of information about clothing and textile theft and some very detailed descriptions of clothing and textile to try and put together a picture of how men and women acquired their clothing in the 17th century and what they wore.
My investigations into the history of clothing go into mostly visual sources. That's what I'm looking for. And I have to try and find picture references. But you also have to go to galleries, you've got to visit exhibitions, you've got to read the books before you can compare any of the material.
One of the reasons nobody has really looked at the clothing of the rural poor is because there's actually remarkably few documentary sources. And from my point of view, the opening into doing this research were the records of the courts of quarter sessions. And when I identified this material in it, I couldn't understand why nobody else had used it, because it was so rich and it was unique. The classic female item of attire is the red petticoat, which is ubiquitous. It appears right the way through the 17th century. For the man, it tends to be sort of fairly coarse canvas or leather doublet and breeches. In other words, hard wearing working clothes. And so those are the sorts of items that I was very keen that the clothing project would make. And there were some other items which emerge as particularly memorable from the documentary research that I did. And in particular, the sort of title of the project, to some extent, is based around this pair of grass green woolen stockings that appear in a theft case from 1648. And so for the woman, she will have a pair of grass green woolen stockings. So whilst I'm not suggesting that all rural poor women living in 17th century Sussex wore such brightly coloured stockings, our woman is going to have a pair.
Whichever thread she had to spare. Danae's research has produced one of the very few clues that we have about what the rural poor might have worn. And that is quite important because there's a lot of records about what the grand and the aristocratic wore in pictures. But referring to the records in this way gives us another clue about what were really thought of as the invisible poor.
Sussex is one of the few counties for which the paper records amongst the quarter sessions actually survive. And so the depositions were taken on paper, but other parts of the process were taken on parchment, which is essentially animal skin. So when they were trying to get rid of material, they got rid of the paper material. So for a lot of counties, that material doesn't exist at all. So most historians will never have encountered this. And so it's quite unusual. It kind of gave me an opening into looking at their clothing, which I wouldn't otherwise have had.
And so your records have shown a strata of society that we don't really know very much about. We know they existed, most certainly, but actually what they wore is something that's become a piece of detective work, I think, for you to track down and try and pin down.
Despite the fact they had very little money and didn't have much variety in their clothing, they did like very, very bright colours. So the brighter the better. I wanted to sort of represent them as people who aspired to look good, even if they couldn't always achieve it.
You found records where people of this very low income group have decorated their clothes with some, both bone lace and with ribbons and a braid.
It was a cheap way of individualising your clothing, was to just accessorise it.
Yes, I quite agree.
The same way as today, that you can change your earrings and look a bit better, feel a bit better, and they did the same.
Probably pay a great deal more for them.
Yeah.
It's been a remarkable opportunity to work with Darren and to have those written sources brought to three-dimensional fruition and actually see two pieces of clothing through to completion, see them in 3 dimensions, actually on human bodies, walking around in Poplar Cottage, doing some domestic activities that might have happened there, and to see how that clothing behaves in the rural landscape that we have in this part of Sussex.
I've been extremely dependent on Barbara for helping me identify what it is I have seen in the documentary evidence. As I sort of went on, one of the areas that sort of Barbara and Lesley helped me was on the colours produced by different types of dye, because as I've mentioned before, this kind of red petticoat that you get all the time, that would usually be produced using the roots of the madder plant. Now, from Barbara and from Lesley, I found out that that could produce varying shades of red, from a sort of pink through to a postbox red. So in other words, if you get
brick red.
Yeah, so if you get a description of a red petticoat, it's not all the same red. Because they're organic dyes, they fade in different ways. And so again, it might have started off being bright red and then it might have gone a different colour. So I'm completely dependent on Barbara and on Lesley for all that practical side.
It's very difficult to come to decisions about historic clothing, and I don't really think I'd want to call them designs, because what we're trying to do is to follow Darren's research and to produce clothing that we know existed. So we have to go to so many sources to look for what might be accurate. It's got to be English, I've got to find a visual source, it's got to be the right period, the right class of person, because that's hugely important for this project.
There are sort of contentious elements to it, in the sense that when the clothing is finally made, somebody can say, no, that's not right. But one of the things I think that we have done, Barbara and I together and with Lesley Parker, is look at such an extensive range of sources and so rigorously and with such attention to detail that we have produced something which is going to be as good as anything else, and I'm pretty confident that that is the case. And if anybody challenged it, I'd be very happy to come back and explain why we have done things in that way. And I think that's one of the, from a sort of intellectual point of view, that is one of the most valuable parts of that project, is it's collating all that evidence and coming up with a definite article, in the sense that you have a physical product to show at the end of it.
Yes, I would agree with that. I would go along with that approach to it as well. I think that's important and perhaps shows the way forward for future clothing projects.